Coming up on today's edition of Locked On Eagles, an Eagles player is talking, and it's making some from back in the day a little bit nervous, giving them some PTSD. We'll get into that and the most underrated Eagles defensive players in franchise history. All that and more on another edition of your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome in, Eagles fans, to a Wednesday edition of the show. I'm Louis DiBiase. He's Gino Camilleri. You can find us on all podcast platforms and on YouTube. Hit us up on Twitter at Locked On Birds, at GC24_football, and at DiBiase LOE. We're your most Italian Philadelphia Eagles podcast, now running strong for 4 years. But, Gino, we've been Eagles fans for a lot longer than that. And we're younger Eagles fans, but we grew up through the great Donovan McNabb era in the early 2000s, and of course the Super Bowl era, and now a new era that's looking pretty promising. And then there was the middle ground, right? The 2010s to start it off. The fun of Michael Vick, Deshaun Jackson, LaShawn McCoy, and Jeremy Maclin in 2010. And then, of course, we went through some hard times in 2011 and 2012, specifically 2015 as well. And a comment from Miles Sanders today has people kind of reminiscing and going back down those roads, Gino, because I don't know if you saw, but Miles Sanders is asked about just how talented this Eagles offense is. And he said something in a similar fashion to what Vince Young said in 2011 when he said it's kind of like a dream team. And again, there was nothing wrong with what Miles Sanders said, and he's actually 100% correct. This offense is loaded. But the way he said it's like all of us on this offense, we kind of feel like we're on an all-star team. It just feels like any time a player gives the Eagles any sort of nickname or any kind of hype, it gets people a little bit nervous. I know me personally, that's exactly what I thought of. So I thought that was really funny to see Eagles Twitter kind of taking both ends of that spectrum today, you know, hyping them up, but also being like, oh no, not again.
I look at it and say that this team feels confident for the first time in the last couple of years. That's what I think it ultimately stems from. I don't think this is a quote-unquote dream team part 2. I don't think we're anywhere close to that. There's a big difference in trading for A.J. Brown and signing guys like Reggie Brown was a part of that
Smith,
team.
Ronnie Brown.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah.
And just all these guys that were at the dog days of their career. This team is building to get to that level, I would say. And what we thought we were getting back then, I would say we're much closer to getting now, because the way that you are building it isn't through these ridiculous free agency acquisitions where you're signing everybody and anybody. It's building a lot of it in-house, taking care of the guys on the roster, and then finding those young core elements, A.J. Brown, for example, Kaiser White, potentially, that you could bring in that are still young and fit the direction of your football team. Yeah. That's what I think Miles Sanders is saying, that for once we have guys that we believe have the most talent in the league at these respected positions. A.J. Brown, top 10 wide receiver. Devontae Smith, potential top 10 wide receiver. Dallas Goedert, all day, top 10, even top 5 type.
Yeah.
For sure. I don't want to push the boundaries too much. And then you look at the rest of the guys around them, one of the better role-playing groups in the NFL. Because you get down to the list and you're saying Boston Scott, who last week I compared, if you were going to have a game, Boston Scott all day long could be the best sixth man in the league. He was leading your team in touchdowns the last couple years for multiple weeks. And I'm pretty sure he was first, if not second, last year in touchdowns for this team.
Not to mention what Kenny Gainwell did in that spot, too, when they gave him a chance, and Wes Watkins.
We haven't even gotten to that part of the conversation yet. And that is a big difference in getting a lot of those guys back then that were finding their way out of the league. There was a reason that they were probably free agents. A lot of those guys that were there in the building that were young were good foundational pieces. Yeah, it's
I think this is
justified. I would say it's justified building it the right way. They're not doing what we thought the dream team was going to do, even 2017, where they tried to replicate that, bring in some free agents to kind of put the Band-Aid over
They won a
wound.
championship.
Right.
I mean,
but
then
look at where
that year.
I'm saying look at where you ended up in 18, 19, 20 because of the way that you built that team. Look at where you ended up after the dream team. Some of the worst and most bad tasting teams in our mouths.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
That we've had for quite some time.
No, yeah, the roster's younger and it's more sustainable in that way. I totally agree. And again, nothing Miles Sanders said I actually had a problem with. It's just funny because, you think back anytime someone kind of puts a label on these things that we've been hyping up and talking about, you do get a little nervous. You think of the dream team. And I think people forget even Michael Vick called the 2012 team the redeem team because he was on an NFL Network interview where they're like, if you don't make the playoffs this year, Andy Reid could get fired. And he's saying, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to redeem the dream team. We're going to be the redeem team. And they won 4-12. And I don't know, just anytime there's any sort of nicknames like the Legion of Zoom in 2015, people were calling DeMarco Murray, Ryan Matthews, and Darren Sproles. And DNA was Deshaun Jackson, Alshon Jeffrey, and Nelson Aguilar. So it's just funny. Hopefully there's no 2022 all-star team we look back at. But I agree with you. I don't think that's going to happen. These guys have justified swagger, and they're mature beyond their years too. So they're not going to, get too overhyped and overconfident before the game starts. I don't think you ever have to worry about that with Jalen Hurts, Devontae Smith. Like, they're confident, but they're like, it's a calm confidence. You know what I mean? Like, Jalen Hurts seems quiet, but it's a quiet, like, definite confidence in his ability in the teams. Devontae's like that. I think A.J. Brown, that really is the entire personality really of that offense when you think about it.
I think they're all guys that, have high confidence in themselves that would then spill over to the rest of the team. We talk about how easy it is to play with Jalen Hurts, and a big reason of that is if I got into the huddle, Lou, in the middle of an SEC game in front of 100,000 people, and this kid has this calm look in his eye and this demeanor about him that nothing is fazing him, that's going to be an easy guy to go into that huddle and play around. Same with A.J. Brown, played big-time football. Devontae Smith played big-time football. You talk about the SEC, Lou, they have overhauled the entire roster with an influx of talent from that conference.
For the first time in a long time, Gino. For the first time in a long time.
In a multitude of ways, through the draft, through trades. I mean, that's how you have to go about it. You have to get good football players that played in the biggest moments that know what it takes to beat the best opponent. Because iron truly does sharpen iron in football, especially in arguably the best conference in maybe any collegiate sport in the entire United States, being the SEC football conference. You add those guys, Landon Dickerson, and that leadership element that comes with being a part of these best programs will then carry it forward.
Yeah.
I look at this team and say, going back, who were those young leaders on that team when they, quote unquote, had a dream team? Not many of those guys were younger on that side and really taking...
I don't think they had any leaders, really, to be honest.
No, at all.
It didn't feel like... It wasn't 2015 where the whole team felt foreign and no one knew what it took to be an Eagle, no sort of team pride and leadership, because they did. Michael Vick was certainly a voice in that locker room, and Jason Peters, and, you had a lot of those veteran offensive linemen. Todd Hermans was still there, right? So, you had a lot of voices, but you're right. I mean, when you brought in so many guys through free agency that... Cullen Jenkins was a Green Bay Packer, and he won a championship there, and he was there forever. And Nnamdi Asomugha and Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie, that was a Raider, that was a Cardinal, and they all came in at the same time, and there was no chemistry. This team, it appears, even with the new guys, have chemistry because these guys are close even outside of football, like Jalen Hurts and A.J. Brown. Yeah, they have never played together in the NFL. They never played in college, but they've known each other since college. Hurts tried to get him to Alabama instead of going to Ole Miss. So, yeah, you made some great points. Totally agree. And there's not actually anything to be concerned about. It's just funny when you see this kind of stuff in the offseason, your red flags instantly go up. That's just, I think, part of being an Eagles fan because there's been a lot of hyped up off seasons, which we've done an entire show about for sure. Gino, but instead of going into things that we've overhyped in the past, the last 2 days we've been talking about some underrated players for the Eagles throughout their franchise's history. Yesterday, we talked about offensive players throughout history that have been, I think, overlooked on this team. Today, I want to get into defense. That's coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles. And guys, today's show is sponsored by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry when you have computers with access to rockauto.com right now, at home and in your pocket? Save time and money with Rock Auto. Don't choose to spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership. Rock Auto, their prices are reliably low for every customer, and they have everything you could need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpet. Go to rockauto.com right now today and see all the parts available for your car or your truck, and make sure you write down Locked On in their "How did you hear about us" box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com today. All right, Eagles fans, welcome back into this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. And we thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. So right now, until training camp starts July 26th, though, we are going 3 to 4 shows a week, but we'll be back Monday through Friday once camp gets rolling at the NovaCare Complex. Really excited to get, things going again, see what players are winning these position battles as they try to make the 53-man roster. And I just can't wait for football time. I enjoy the summer a lot, but the dead zone, I need my football fix. Sometimes you get a little fatigue, especially like throughout right when the draft ends, you're like, okay, I need a breather. But when you're an addict like we are, you only need like a week or two breather. You know what I mean?
I always said when I was in high school that July 4th was really the end of summer for us. And
Right.
in New York, we have to preface this, we started school around the first week of September, and we would go until around the last week of June. So once July 4th hit, you had the rest of July, August, and you're getting ready to go back to school. But once it hit, it went fast. And that's what I always think about this for football season. Once 4th of July hits, you're going to see teams going back into training camp within the next 2 weeks. I know, being in Western New York, that was always the time as a kid that I was forced to go to the Buffalo Bills preseason training camp at St. John Fisher, and I would always end up getting a signed ball by all these guys that end up getting cut.
I would just go and try to find former Eagles.
Troy Vincent was the one that I really targeted when he became a Buffalo Bill. That was a very cool moment when I got to meet Troy Vincent. But we're in the swing of it. It's hot out. In the dog days of the summer when those kids are practicing down in Texas, it's probably 110 degrees, and you just get that feel of football in the air once again in this time of year. And the NFL in particular, I know it's hard to really take time off from this league because they make it a 12-month cycle, and we're right back into the next season. We're going to be talking about our 5th season together, Lou, on this show within a couple weeks here.
Can't wait. And Gino, it's funny you mentioned Troy Vincent because on today's show, we're going to talk about some all-time underrated players for the Eagles on the defensive side of the football. And I want to start there. Let's go into the secondary and we'll go down the line. We'll go through safety, corner, linebacker, and the defensive line. And let's start at corner because you mentioned Troy Vincent. And there's a lot of hyped up players. I think we've always talked about, man, the Eagles haven't had great corners since the days of Troy Vincent, Bobby Taylor, Lito Shepherd and Sheldon Brown. We bring that up a lot, right? But I don't think a lot of those players are looked at specifically, individually, I should say. I think, honestly, Troy Vincent and Bobby Taylor are two of the more underrated defensive backs in Eagles history. I think Bobby Taylor especially, and you've said that before in this show.
I think Bobby Taylor's 2002 season might be one of the most underrated seasons in Philadelphia Eagles history when it comes to defending
Super
the
cool
pass.
Jersey to have is a Champions Eagles Bobby Taylor jersey, number 21.
Oh, yeah, man. I loved Bobby Taylor. He was really the odd man out of that group. He wasn't the flashy pick of a guy like Lito Shepherd, and the rest of the group that they had there was Sheldon Brown, who is another high pick as well. And he goes behind guys like Troy Vincent when you're talking about these discussions. But Bobby Taylor was an instrumental part of those runs in the early 2000s. That 2002 season he had 5 interceptions in a league that at the time was based more around running the football than it is today, where it is primarily passing based, where you see these seasons where Trevon Diggs is getting close to double-digit interceptions nearly halfway through the year. That just doesn't happen in the early 2000s. Bobby Taylor did that on a team where I would say you talk about these guys individually don't get talked about as much. Like the sum was greater than the parts of the whole, I would say.
Yeah, they're all grouped
that
together,
group,
kind of.
Yeah, you throw them all into a pie, and it's how good they were in the early 2000s because of all of these players. And you have to start with both of those guys, Vincent, Bobby Taylor. Without those two guys, Lito Shepherd and Sheldon Brown set up for success to take that next step without that veteran leadership in the building in front of them.
I mean, they had Hugh Douglas and, Corey Simon, I think is underrated up front of the defensive line. Like they had a good defensive line, but before Javon Curse came in 2004, I think the star power was actually in the secondary. Like right now, the Eagles like to build from the line back on defense. But in the early 2000s, I think the secondary was the strength of this football team. And Bobby Taylor was one of them. Like you said, that 2002 season where he made the Pro Bowl, 5 interceptions, 23 pass deflections, 58 tackles. That was his best year, but he had 1, 2, 3 other seasons with at least 3 interceptions, had 4 in 1999. Yeah, Bobby Taylor overall, I think of those 4 we talk about, Vincent, Shepherd, Brown, and Taylor is maybe the least talked about. And I agree. I think he's extremely underrated. And Gino, I think a little bit, I think it's going to go down, not like all time, but I think we're seeing it because of the success he's having elsewhere and because of the flashes he's shown in Philly. And you kind of see now the difference between Jim Schwartz and Jonathan Gannon's scheme, maximizing a player. I'm telling you, I think eventually we're going to be talking about Rasul Douglas as one of the more underrated players that got away. I'm telling you, man. The year he had in Green Bay, what he did in 2018, I think we're going to look back and be like, Jim Schwartz did not use that player correctly.
I think he had many lightning in a bottle qualities that one year where he had several huge moments. I mean, the first game of the season against Atlanta, he goes out there with the game on the line and has an interception that really changed the tide of that first game of the season.
And then the final month of the season, he was a top 10 graded PFF corner and number 1 against the run too, man. Like he got hot here once and then they didn't give him really a chance again. And now he got a chance in Green Bay and he's doing it still. But
I think there are a lot of guys out there as well. I mean, the pick of Jordan Poyer in the 7th round, if we're getting that deep into things.
Talk about one that got away.
A player drafted before his days, and he became a versatile piece who can move inside and out, really play that nickel overhang position as that safety that could come down into the box and play on the back end. That's one guy that, if you talk about all-time bad moves by the front office, that's got to be one of them. Absolutely.
That's another Chip Kelly blunder. People don't really talk about a lot. Gino, you're a safety guy, and I don't know, there are a lot of underrated safeties in Eagles history. Like, who would be the one overlooked player, you think?
I think for what Quentin Mikell did as a part of that team. I wrote down
Quentin Mikell, too.
Yeah. I don't think we respected him as much as we should have because we saw once Mikell left that back end and the Brian Dawkins, that whole wall came crashing down once the two of them were gone.
Yeah.
How barren of a wasteland it was back there for the years until they got Malcolm Jenkins and then they signed Rodney McLeod, which that's a 6-7 year gap where you really didn't invest these resources into high quality players. Yeah, you go out and you pick Nate Allen and you pick Jaquin Jarrett, but those guys weren't good football players. Going back, they weren't good football players. You had multiple guys there, even beyond just Brian Dawkins and Quentin Mikell. There was a handful of other guys that were sprinkled in that mix that helped those other two out. But the top 2 guys were Quentin Mikell, Brian Dawkins in that era. Quentin Mikell isn't going to get his respect because he had the best needle safety ever playing besides him. But he's not that good without Brian Dawkins and vice versa. And I think we really took for granted what Quentin Mikell was as a player. And you always go back to those games and you see him make plays and you're like, man, I forgot we had this guy who's maybe the 8th, 9th best piece on this defense probing the back end
And
there.
at first, it's probably too because he started off as a special teams ace, kind of like TJ Edwards in a way, and Michael Lewis that was the second-hand man to, Brian Dawkins back there. But, he took over, and we always say Malcolm Jenkins kind of saved you from safety hell after Brian Dawkins was gone. But people forget Quentin Mikell was the first one to hold down the fort in 2009 and 2010 in between Dawkins and Jenkins. He made the Pro Bowl in 2009 with, he had 4 straight years where he had at least 88 plus tackles. He had 3 interceptions in 2 of 3 years in 2008 and 2000 through 2010. He was a good safety. And, again, he wasn't Brian Dawkins. He wasn't Malcolm Jenkins. But yeah, Gino, it could have been a lot worse, 2010, 2009, 2011 without Michael back there. So I totally agree. And then, before we take a break, just to go into linebacker real quick, another guy that played here recently, I think Michael Kendricks is a little overlooked. I was looking back at his numbers, and it's like he was pretty versatile for this team. I don't think they nearly used him enough as a blitzer, considering his explosiveness he had. Looking at his numbers, pretty good. The 5th most tackles ever for an inside linebacker in Eagles history. He's tied for the 5th most sacks for an inside linebacker in franchise history. Was here for 6 years. Adjusted really well in the Super Bowl season when everybody thought he was going to get cut by Jim Schwartz because he didn't fit the scheme. Jordan Hicks went down. Kendricks really had one of his better years of his career in a championship season. I think Michael Kendricks, and it was cool he wore number 95. I think, of course, the stuff that happened with him, the insider trading after, puts a bad taste in everybody's mouth. But, for 6 seasons, you get a good amount out of a second-round linebacker. I thought Kendricks was pretty good for this team. But again, they added so much around him. D'Amico Ryans stole some of the thunder, and Kiko Alonso and Hicks.
Keep
and
taking
Bradham.
these names away from. I was going to say D'Amico Ryans is another piece,
but he was just in a big.
Underrated.
He was in a deep group with a lot of names, and I think Kendricks was always pretty much your most consistent guy.
He definitely was the most consistent because I think he gave you the most versatility. He was probably the one guy you could count on in coverage out of that group. Maybe Kiko Alonso there for a little bit before he made his way out of town there that one season. I mean, you were going to throw D'Amico Ryans out there and to cover the flat, that's for sure. But at the same time, without D'Amico Ryans, is Michael Kendricks that good? That's the conversation I love to have with these underrated players, is the context around them. D'Amico Ryans was the quarterback of that defense, and we've seen how brilliant he is taking that and going to the coaching ranks. So to say how good Kendricks was early on could be in large part to having D'Amico Ryans be the quarterback of your defense back there, putting all these guys in the right position to make sure they did things well. And once D'Amico Ryans went down that one season, you saw how badly that linebacker play had fallen off. And the 1-2 of having both of them next to each other didn't play as well when they were separated, I would say. Those two guys out of that group, I would say, meshed the best and really did fit what they were trying to do. I don't think they ever really got both of them playing consistently well at the same time, which really hurt them.
They really did bring some stability to linebacker, Gino, together after 2012, because you look back and, in between Jeremiah Trotter and those guys, they were running through Jamar Chaney and trying to make Casey Matthews work, Brian Roll, Keenan Clayton, Akeem Jordan, Stuart Bradley. It was brutal. So you're definitely right. Ryans and Kendricks brought some stability and consistency to the linebacker position. And for a while there, I totally agree. So I think Ryans and Kendricks, 2 very underrated linebackers. I want to get into with you coming up next, the defensive line. We'll start thinking about some pass rushers throughout Eagles history that are underrated, edge rushers and defensive tackles right here on Locked On Eagles.
But before we do that, we have a message from our friends over at the official sportsbook of the entire Locked On Podcast Network and the Locked On Eagles podcast. Of course, Lou and I, when we get off the show, first thing we do, we're opening up our phones. We're checking the latest odds on everything. In the NBA right now, I know it's madness. I know it's mayhem. Trade season is upon us. You can bet on futures of where players are going to end up. James Harden opts out of his contract today. Does he want to re-sign in Philadelphia? You can bet on all.
Murray just got traded from the Atlanta Hawks. Yeah, man. Absolutely.
Did he really? I did not see that. But
yeah, the Hawks traded 2 firsts and Danilo Gallinari for DeJounte Murray to the Spurs.
Danilo Gallinari, a fellow Italian,
baby.
listener of the podcast. I hope so. Fingers crossed. But I hope he's also somebody that takes advantage of the best sports book on the web right now, betonline.net. As I said, you can bet on any player props, player futures. Right now, you have tennis going on in the offseason. You're going to have football coming up here in a couple weeks. Week 0 of college football is going to be much closer than we thought. You have MLB going on right now. You have boxing, MMA happening all year long. It is fight week, literally called fight week, the first week of July. Huge fights going on in MMA. Put your bets in at betonline.net because it's the easiest and biggest and most effective, and I'm going to say you're going to win the most money out of all the sports books on betonline.net.
All right, Eagles fans, we're wrapping up this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles. I'm Louis DiBiase, and he's Gino Camilleri. We're getting into underrated all-time defensive players for the Philadelphia Eagles. Going through cornerback, talking about Bobby Taylor. You hit at safety, Quentin Mikell, at linebacker, D'Amico Ryans, and Michael Kendricks. And then, Gino, you go to the position up front of the trenches the Eagles invest more in than maybe any team. I would say the offensive and defensive line, as we've said before on the show. And there's been a lot of star power up front for the last 30, 40, really all time in Eagles history. There's a lot of stars in the defensive line. When you look back and think about underrated pass rushers on the edge, defensive tackles, are there any, first names that pop up to you?
I think you have to look back at the end of one of the great dynasties of defenses in that Eagles 90s defense, and a player that, God rest his soul, Jerome Brown. I mean, if he plays the entirety of a career, you can make the conversation that he could have been one of the top interior defensive linemen of all time. And we're saying that, right now Fletcher Cox is number 1 in Eagles history. I don't think it would have even been relatively close if Brown was on that field, with how good everything was around him and how good individually he was as a player. And I still don't think he gets that respect. I think he's a guy who played maybe 20 years too early as an interior penetrator, somebody that's just a dog on the inside that's going to get upfield and get after it. Talk about why that defense was so good. Yeah, you got Reggie, but you can't forget how good Jerome Brown was there, man.
And, Gino, you can't forget how good Clyde Simmons was on the other side.
Yeah, there you go.
And I know these guys benefited from Reggie White, but you can't deny. I looked at Clyde Simmons' numbers even after later in his career when he was with teams like Phoenix and he was with Chicago. 121 career sacks. He had
Phoenix. Did you say Phoenix?
Well, because back in the day when he was on the team, they were Phoenix still. I'm being historically
when
correct.
When they were in the NFC East back then?
Yeah, absolutely. And so Simmons had, listen to this, seasons of 19 sacks, 15 and a half, 13. He had an 11 sack season, 2 years of 8 sacks, 2 of 7.5, and 1 of 7. Like Clyde Simmons was a dog on the other side of Reggie White. I mean, Gino, you mentioned Jerome Brown too. Andy Harmon, I was looking at his numbers. He had a couple double-digit sack seasons in the 90s. We've seen the Football Outsiders before say the 91 Eagles defense is the greatest of all time when it comes to DVOA, their efficiency metric. It's tragic that team only came away with 1 playoff win in its entire history of that core. I mean, crazy.
A lot of factors in play into that and to why that played out like it was, but assembled all at once, man. You talk about just a steel curtain, like a literal steel curtain where you're going to run the ball and those guys are going to be in your face within a second and a half.
Seth
because
Joyner and the hardest hitting safety, made one of them ever, Andre Waters, and Eric Allen should be in the Hall of Fame already.
Yeah, no kidding. Dude. What are we doing on the Eric Allen
I have
front?
No idea. 2 Eagles corners. Asante Samuel should be in there too, by the way.
I think we've been pounding the Eric Allen front here for a couple years since we did our ultimate Eagles draft a couple seasons back. And I just wish we were alive and cognizant of what was going on to see that 91 team and how good it truly was. And I see why old Eagles fans or older Eagles fans, anytime you talk about how good that early 2000s team was, they'll always bring up how good that early 90s team was, because you talk about the margins of great and elite. I mean, you could say that both of them were in the elite category, but then that 91 team was in an S tier if you're going to tier it out.
Gino, thank God I didn't grow up in the 90s. You know how I don't let things go and like to talk about what ifs. If I would have grew up in that era with how talented that team was and they didn't do anything, I wouldn't have shut up about it forever.
Yeah, I think every generation of Eagles fans has really had that slap in the face. And
that
I was
white whale.
Yeah, I was thinking about it when you were explaining it, like these stretches where at cornerback they go like 6-7 years without really having any. But it's almost when you look at like a timeline of history of the world, right? It's like those Ice Age chunks where just nothing happened. It's like we just forgot about that. Nothing really went on, and every generation of Eagles fans has had that time period.
I agree.
Because after the early 90s, you know what happened towards the end of the 90s and what would become into the Donovan McNabb era. And then that cycle begins again after 2006. And then we get into the early 2000s and here we are again. And every generation has had that. But at the same time, I think every generation of Eagles fans has had that player where you look back and say, yeah, you might not think about him. For me, it's Rosalio Haason. I think about those middle 2000s Eagles teams where the secondary was still trying to find the replacement for those guys that we had talked about. Sheldon was still there. I mean, Lito was still there. You have that tandem there. The third guy, Rosalio Haason, did a damn good job for a few years, and I don't think he's ever gotten his appreciation. And I'm sure every single Eagles fan has that one player where you say, yeah, he'll always have a place in my heart.
Gino, how about before we wrap up, defensive tackle? I mean, you look at this team tried for a while to bring in some more explosive players, and you look at defensive tackle, they brought in Broderick Bunkley, didn't really work out, never really met that ceiling. Cullen Jenkins, as we said, didn't work out. How about Mike Patterson? I mean, Mike Patterson was reliable for a long time. And I think, too, he was a good veteran leader for Fletcher Cox, mentioned him by name. Like when he talked about mentoring Jordan Davis, he talked about some of his mentors. And Mike Patterson was somebody that brought him along early in his career. I think Patterson was a guy, too, pretty reliable inside when, the other defensive tackle spot really wasn't working well. So, yeah, you're right, though. There's always those defensive or just overall players that are underrated, but you always, again, mine will be Rasul Douglas in the modern Eagles era that you don't let go as much as others do.
Oh, there will always be that. And
some of them will be ridiculous, like Dennis Dixon for me. I still think in 2013 might have been okay as a starter.
Dude, I mean, I love J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. In 20 years, people are going to be like, oh, you actually enjoyed watching this guy play for like any amount of time at all. And I did. And I think that's the one thing about having that fan element to our show is that we have stories like this and like where we were in times and why you fall in love with teams is, I think, first through players. And that's why
I don't know how you emotionally detach from football. I mean, it just seems impossible to me. I don't know.
Oh, no, I mean, as soon as I fell in love with Donovan McNabb at Syracuse and he gets drafted to Philly and I become an Eagles fan, it's like even after Donovan's gone, I've put so much stock already into watching this team. That's my team through and through. And I don't have that physical being in Philadelphia to support that team, but I have stories like this where I'll never forget some moments of Rosalio Haason and Bobby Taylor and on the offensive side of the ball. I don't know if you mentioned Carell Buckhalter on the show yesterday.
No, but I didn't, but that's a good one. I talked about it running back. Ricky Waters, Ajayi, but Carell Buckhalter's a really good one. Yeah, man, absolutely.
Love Carell Buckhalter. He goes to Denver and has a pretty successful career too. Yeah. And you always just find those guys that you'll follow even when they're gone from Philadelphia.
No, absolutely. Well, that's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Eagles. Guys, we appreciate you tuning in. We've got a couple more podcasts for you this week. Make sure you subscribe wherever you get the show, all podcast platforms in audio form. And we're on video on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to our channel. We hit over 1,000 subscribers. Thank you guys so much for helping us grow our video content. And we're always talking birds for you on Twitter. Hit us up. Who are your most underrated Eagles of all time? At Locked On Birds, at DiBiase, LOE, and at GC24_football. For Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Now make sure your second listen is the Locked On NFL podcast. All the news across the league in under 30 minutes. It's free and available wherever you get your shows. As always, thank you for downloading. Thank you for watching and listening. And let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.